He's got questions to ask, and a fire that won't die, unraveling each task under the sky. Oh, Digger 420, curious Canuck, answers on your mind, never getting stuck.
Because, you know. How about now? Oh my gosh, did it work that time? Can you hear me now? You have no idea, MSO. Can you guys at least hear me? Yes. Oh man, it's only something I've clicked on a bunch of times. So I don't know. I've been playing the silly game with the headphones. My mic worked. My mic was fine, but I couldn't get the headphones to work. I couldn't hear anything. And I've been dicking around with it for a while now. And I thought I'd finally got it. So I went live, but then I realized that it wouldn't register my thing. And it's a whole big thing. You kind of fixed it, Brian. I just went back into settings and started randomly clicking on the different microphone things. So it's temporarily, it's fixed for the stream, but I still don't know how to get it to work right for everything. I was trying my damnedest to be on a Discord phone call this morning. At first, like I said, at first my mic worked, but my headphones didn't work. And then I did something on the PC in the settings, and I can't get myself back there. But whatever I did made the headphones work, but not the microphone. It like switched it. Fucking frustrating. I know it wasn't, or the light wasn't lit up because I hadn't plugged that part of the headphones in. Wouldn't that have been great if all I had to do was push that one last thing in to light up the lights and suddenly the mic did work? That would have been nice. Something simple. I am really good if it's plug and play, but if it's not, I'm hooped. And then I start just clicking buttons and looking through things, and like I said, hitting something to switch it so that, then the headphones worked, but the microphone didn't. And I had no way to get back there and even just undo what I'd done because I couldn't get there. But what the hell, it is what it is. Tech doesn't like me, but I'll figure it out. Oh, I see. I see. Yeah, no, I just didn't plug that part in to light up the lights because I hadn't gotten that far. But anyways, the good news is the way I have it plugged in now, I can leave the little double jack thing plugged into the PC and just unplug the headphones. So the PC won't have to adjust every time I unplug and plug them in, like I used to do with the old ones. So there's that. And hopefully, if it's working in here, maybe it'll work in Discord as well. Maybe. I don't know. Anyways, I'm here. You're here. It's Thursday morning and we're reading a book. So there you go. There. We are, I wish it was cheap to send you things. Oh, I know. It's stupid trying to get anything across the border here. I guess Australia is a lot like Canada. It's just, it's ridiculous to send anything. Oh, I appreciate that so much, Brian. I am being told by multiple sources now that that's what I need is an actual, like a mic on a stand and that sort of thing. I never thought I would have to get that technical, but I guess I kind of do. If I want to do this and I want to make it work right, then I can't just keep leaning on plug and play and hoping like hell it'll work every time, right? I need to get some better tools for my trade, I guess is the thing. So I'll add that to my list, but thank goodness it's fixed for now. I can do this stream and I can worry about it again later. Yeah. See, and my old one, in that respect, it was really great plug and play as well, but it was getting old anyways. So the fact that I accidentally broke the one hinge is not, it's not surprising. But it was just one mic jack. So there was literally, that's all you could do. This one's a little bit fancier. It does have you can just do one mic jack thing, which didn't work for me, as we saw the other day. So I'm using the splitter thing now. And it seems like it likes it better. But I can't plug it in because for whatever reason, the jacks on the front of the PC don't want to work. They don't want to recognize stuff that's plugged in there, which is really a pain in the ass because that's the ones I used. It gave me just that extra little stretch to go and, feed the cats or pour a coffee or something. So who knows? I may have to rethink the whole thing again anyways. But what can you do when you live in a shoe, right? At least my breath doesn't smell like poo. So there is that. Now, Brian, do you think you're going to be okay? If I start reading here, you're going to be okay? Mein Kampf. No, I haven't started that one. Hi, Magic 8 Ball. I did, however, I was on top of some things. If you guys want to go to my YouTube channel in the community, oh, don't worry, Magic. If you want to go to the community page on my YouTube channel, I've got just a question. Anyone have any book suggestions? I need author and title are the bare minimum I'd need. If it's something more specific, like the Behold a Pale Horse, the one I was reading was specifically a first edition because they've made changes. So if you want me to do something like that, but it needs to be a specific earlier edition, you gotta tell me that too. For these reading sessions, I prefer to read something that's entertaining, but also kind of we're learning something. To be honest, I may have problems. I'm working on an emergency right now, and I'm working with a $60,000 piece of equipment. All right. Well, then you might want to, now that we can hear me, maybe you might want to mute me. Concentrate on what you're doing, boy. But yeah, so I would rather read something that is somewhat educational, not necessarily like dry and boring, like a carpenter book or something like that. But I want to be learning stuff. Has he actually written that yet? I thought that was just going to be like a coffee table book with a bunch of silly pictures of him and sound bites. Because I'm gay, because I'm a pussy. Yeah, there's a lot of those sort of quotes. That would be funny. That would be a funny merch idea for him. It's a coffee table book with just his "I'm not gay" quotes. But yeah, so we did Behold a Pale Horse and Other Tall Tales, says Bowls Deep. Yep. I'm not gay and other tall tales. I did not swallow cum and other gay tales. But yeah, we did Behold the Pale Horse. It was a really great book, very educational, very heavy on the legalese, the politicalese. They were really big words and lots of them with little punctuation. It's a lot of it was government paperwork, right? So they're trying to obfuscate everything. So it was a bit of a heavier go, but I did learn a lot. And I want to look into executive orders now and just how much power they do or do not have. Would be very interesting. We're doing The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat right now. We're just about to start part 3. This is really interesting, talking about injuries and deficits to the right hemisphere of the brain, which isn't really discussed as often. So I'm finding it very interesting for my own personal benefit and knowledge. Next book, I've talked to the author, who happens to be a friend of mine, which I really appreciate. So the next book we are going to read is going to be Prepare for Individual Freedom. Stephen Gosney. Steve is a very good man. He's really intelligent. He's written all sorts of books in all sorts of genres. But this one is one I've bought, I've read. I started rereading again, as you can see. But he was kind enough to send me a PDF for the latest edition of it, because this is a first edition. So I'll be reading from the PDF, the latest edition of Prepare, which is going to be quite entertaining. There's a lot of people in there that I may not know personally, but I've heard of or seen on, YouTube, that sort of thing. So that's going to be a lot of fun. After that, I have zero idea what we're going to do. So I need you guys to get over to the community page on YouTube and tell me what other books I should be reading. I do believe someone had given me another book, but it's not written there. So I think I know where it is that I wrote it down. Can't remember what book it was at the moment or who suggested it. But yeah, I need suggestions, need books. I also need the time to be able to go and get access to the books. So that being said, yeah, we're 16 minutes in. We might as well continue reading then, eh? So we are part 3 transports. And this is the introduction. While we have criticized the concept of function, even attempting a rather radical redefinition, we have adhered to it nevertheless, drawing in the broadest terms, contrast based on deficit or excess. But it is clear that wholly other terms also have to be used. As soon as we attend to a phenomenon as such, to the actual quality of experience or thought or action, we have to use terms more reminiscent of a poem or painting. How, say, is a dream intelligible in terms of function? We have always two universes of discourse, call them physical and phenomenal, or what you will. One dealing with questions of quantitative and formal structure, the other with those qualities that constitute a world. All of us have our own distinctive mental worlds, our own inner journeyings and landscapes, and these, for most of us, require no clear neurological correlate. We can usually tell a man's story, relate passages and scenes from his life, without bringing in any physiological or neurological considerations. Such considerations would seem at least supererogatory. Sorry. Hi, AP. Sorry. We can usually tell a man's story, relate passages and scenes from his life, without bringing in any physiological or neurological considerations. Such considerations would seem, at the least, supererogatory, if not frankly absurd or insulting. For we consider ourselves, and rightly, free, at least determined by the most complex human and ethical considerations, rather than by the vicissitudes of our neural functions or nervous systems. Usually, but not always. For sometimes a man's life may be cut across, transformed by an organic disorder, and if so, his story does require a physiological or neurological correlate. This, of course, is so with all the patients here described. In the first half of this book, we described cases of the obviously pathological, situations in which there were some blatant neurological excess or deficit. Sooner or later, it is obvious to such patients or their relatives, no less than to their doctors, that there is something physically the matter. Their inner worlds, their dispositions, may indeed be altered, transformed. But as becomes clear, this is due to some gross and almost quantitative change in neural function. In this third section, the presenting feature is reminiscence, altered perception, and imagination, a dream. Such matters do not often come to neurological or medical notice. Such transports, often of poignant intensity, and shot through with the personal feeling and meaning, tend to be seen, like dreams, as psychical, as a manifestation, perhaps, of unconscious or preconscious activity, or in the mystically minded, of something spiritual, not as something medical, let alone neurological. They have an intrinsic dramatic or narrative or personal sense, and so are not apt to be seen as symptoms. It may be in the nature of transports that they are more likely to be confided to psychoanalysts or confessors, to be seen as psychoses, or to be broadcast as religious revelations, rather than brought to physicians. For it never occurs to us at first that a vision might be medical, and if an organic basis is suspected or found, this may be felt to devalue the vision, though of course it does not. Valuation have nothing to do with etiology. All the transports described in this section do have more or less clear organic determinants, though it was not evident to begin with, but required careful investigation to bring out. This does not detract in the least from their psychological or spiritual significance. If God or the eternal order was revealed to Dostoevsky in seizures, why should not other organic conditions serve as portals to the beyond or the unknown? In a sense, this section is a study of such portals. Hewlings Jackson in 1880 described such transports or portals as dreamy states. Or dreamy states. In the course of certain epileptics, used the general word reminiscence. He wrote, I should never diagnose epilepsy from the paroxysmal occurrence of reminiscence without the other symptoms, although I should suspect epilepsy if that superpositive mental state began to occur very frequently. I have never been consulted for reminiscence only, but I have been so consulted for the forced or paroxysmal reminiscence of tunes or visions of presences or scenes, not only in epilepsy, but in a variety of other organic conditions. Such transports or reminiscences are not uncommon in migraine. See the visions of Hildegard, chapter 20. We'll get there. This sense of going back, whether on an epileptic or toxic basis, suffuses a passage to India, chapter 17. A plainly toxic or chemical basis underlies incontinent nostalgia, chapter 16. And the strange hyperosmia of dog beneath the skin, chapter 18. Hyperosmia, there we go. Either seizure activity or a frontal lobe disinhibition determines the horrifying reminiscence of murder in chapter 19. The theme of this section is the power of imagery and memory to transport a person as a result of abnormal stimulation of the temporal lobes and limbic system of the brain. This may even teach us something of the cerebral basis of certain visions and dreams, and of how the brain, which Sherrington called an enchanted loom, may weave a magic carpet to transport us. So, chapter 15, Reminiscence. Mrs. O.C. Mrs. O.C. was somewhat deaf, but otherwise in good health. She lived in an old people's home. One night in January 1979, she dreamt vividly, nostalgically, of her childhood in Ireland, and especially of the songs they danced to and sang. When she woke up, the music was still going, very loud and clear. I must still be dreaming, she thought, but this was not so. She got up, roused and puzzled. It was the middle of the night. Someone, she assumed, must have left a radio playing. But why was she the only person to be disturbed by it? She checked every radio she could find. They were all turned off. Then she had another idea. She had heard that dental fillings could sometimes act like a crystal radio, picking up stray broadcasts with unusual intensity. That's it, she thought. One of my fillings is playing up. It won't last long, and I'll get it fixed in the morning. She complained to the night nurse, who said her fillings looked fine. At this point, another notion occurred to Mrs. O.C. What sort of radio station, she reasoned to herself, would play Irish songs deafeningly in the middle of the night? Songs, just songs, without introduction or comment, and only songs that I know. What radio station would play my songs and nothing else? At this point, she asked herself, is the radio in my head? She was now thoroughly rattled, and the music continued, deafening. Her last hope was her ENT man, the otologist she was seeing. He would reassure her, tell her it was just noises in the ear, something to do with her deafness, nothing to worry about. But when she saw him in the course of the morning, he said, "No, Mrs. O.C., I don't think it's your ears. A simple ringing or buzzing or rumbling, maybe, but a concert of Irish songs, that's not your ears. Maybe," he continued, "you should see a psychiatrist." Mrs. O.C. arranged to see a psychiatrist the same day. No, Mrs. O.C., the psychiatrist said. It's not your mind, and you're not mad. And the mad don't hear music, they only hear voices. That's not quite true. You must see a neurologist, my colleague, Dr. Sachs. And so Miss O.C. came to me. Conversation was far from easy, partly because Mrs. O.C.'s deafness, but more because I was repeatedly drowned out by songs. She could only hear me through the softer ones. She was bright, alert, not delirious or mad, but with a remote, absorbed look, as of someone half in a world of their own. I could find nothing neurologically amiss. Nonetheless, I suspected that the music was neurological. What could have happened to Mrs. O.C. to bring her to such a pass? She was 88 and in excellent general health, with no hint of fever. She was not on any medications which might unbalance her excellent mind, and manifestly, she had been normal the day before. Do you think it's a stroke, doctor? She asked, reading my thoughts. It could be, I said, though I've never seen a stroke like this. Something has happened, that's for sure. But I don't think you're in danger. Pardon me. Don't worry and hold on. It's not so easy to hold on, she said, when you're going through what I'm going through. I know it's quiet here, but I am in an ocean of sound. I wanted to do an electroencephalogram straight away, paying special attention to the temporal lobes, the musical lobes of the brain. But circumstances conspired to prevent this for a while. In this time, the music grew less loud, and above all, less persistent. She was able to sleep after the first 3 nights, and increasingly to make and hear conversation between songs. By the time I came to do an EEG, she heard only occasional brief snatches of music, a dozen times, more or less, in the course of a day. After we had settled her, after we had settled her and applied the electrodes to her head, I asked her to lie still, say nothing, and not sing to herself, but to raise her right forefinger slightly, which in itself would not disturb the EEG, if she heard any of her songs as we recorded. In the course of a 2-hour recording, she raised her finger on 3 occasions, and each time she did this, the EEG pens clattered and transcribed spikes and sharp waves in the temporal lobes of the brain. This confirmed that she was indeed having temporal lobe seizures, which, as Hewlings Jackson guessed and Wilder Penfield proved, are the invariable basis of reminiscence and experiential hallucinations. But why should she suddenly develop this strange symptom? I obtained a brain scan, and this showed that she had indeed had a small thrombosis or infarction in part of her right temporal lobe. The sudden onset of Irish songs in the night, the sudden activation of musical memory traces in the cortex, were apparently the consequence of a stroke, and as it resolved, so the songs resolved too. By mid-April, the songs had entirely gone, and Mrs. O.C. was herself once again. I asked her at this point how she felt about it all, and in particular, whether she missed the paroxysmal songs she heard. It's funny you should ask that, she said with a smile. Mostly, I would say, it's a great relief. But yes, I do miss the old songs a little. Now, with lots of them, I can't even recall them. It was like being given back a forgotten memory of my childhood again. And some of the songs were really lovely. I had heard similar sentiments from some of my patients on L-Dopa. The term I used was incontinent nostalgia. And what Mrs. O.C. told me, her obvious nostalgia, put me in mind of a poignant story H.G. Wells, The Door in the Wall. So I told her the story. That's it, she said. That captures the mood, the feeling entirely. But my door is real, as my wall was real. My door leads to the lost and forgotten past. I did not see a similar case until June last year, when I was asked to see Mrs. O.M., who was now a resident at the same home. Mrs. OM, who was also a woman in her 80s, also somewhat deaf, also bright and alert. She too heard music in the head and sometimes a ringing or hissing or rumbling. Occasionally she heard voices talking, usually far away and several at once, so that she could never catch what they were saying. She hadn't mentioned these symptoms to anybody and had secretly worried for 4 years that she was mad. She was greatly relieved when she heard from the sister that there had been a similar case in the home some time before, and very relieved to be able to open up to me. One day, Mrs. OM recounted, while she was grating parsnips in the kitchen, a song started playing. It was Easter Parade and was followed in swift succession by Glory, Glory, Hallelujah and Good Night, Sweet Jesus. Like Mrs. OC, she assumed that a radio had been left on, but quickly discovered that all the radios were off. This was in 1979, 4 years earlier. Mrs. OC recovered in a few weeks, but Mrs. OM's music continued and got worse and worse. At first, she would hear only these 3 songs, sometimes spontaneously out of the blue, but for certain if she chanced to think of any of them. She tried, therefore, to avoid thinking of them, but the avoidance of thinking was as provocative as the thinking. Do you like these particular songs? I asked, psychiatrically. Do they have some special meaning to you? No, she answered promptly. I've never especially liked them, and I don't think they had any special meaning for me. And how did you feel when they kept going on? I came to hate them, she replied with great force. It was like some crazy neighbor continually putting on the same record. For a year or more, there was nothing but these songs in maddening succession. After this, and though it was worse in one way, it was also a relief, the inner music became more complex and various. She would hear countless songs, sometimes several simultaneously. Sometimes she would hear an orchestra or choir, and occasionally voices, or a mere hubbub of noises. When I came to examine Mrs. OM, I found nothing abnormal except in her hearing, and here what I found was of singular interest. She had some inner ear deafness of a commonplace sort, but over and above this, she had a peculiar difficulty in the perception and discrimination of tones of a kind which neurologists call amusia, and which is especially correlated with impaired function in the auditory or temporal lobes of the brain. She herself complained that recently the hymns in the chapel seemed more and more alike, so that she could scarcely distinguish them by tone or tune, but had to rely on the words or the rhythm. A similar inability to perceive vocal tone or expression, tonal agnosia, was shown by my patient Emily D. See the president's speech. And although she had been a fine singer in the past, when I tested her, she sang flat and out of tune. She mentioned, too, that her inner music was most vivid when she woke up, becoming less so as other sensory impressions crowded in, and that it was least likely to occur when she was occupied, emotionally, intellectually, but especially visually. In the hour or so she was with me, she heard music only once, a few bars of Easter's Parade, played so loud and so suddenly she could hardly hear me through it. Nice, AP. Kash Patel was confirmed. He's officially confirmed. Time to go Old Testament on the corrupt plot waffles in the federal government. Amen, brother. This will be fun. This whole thing is going to be one big, popcorn and soda event, right? Just it's going to be so much fun to watch. When we came to do an EEG on Mrs. OM, it showed strikingly high voltage and excitability in both temporal lobes, those parts of the brain associated with the central representation of sounds and music, and with the evocation of complex experiences and scenes. And whenever she heard anything, the high voltage waves became sharp, spike-like, and frankly convulsive. This confirmed my thought that she too had musical epilepsy associated with disease of the temporal lobes. But what was going on with Mrs. OC and Mrs. OM? Musical epilepsy sounds like a contradiction in terms, for music normally is full of feeling and meaning and corresponds to something deep in ourselves, the world behind the music, in Thomas Mann's phrase. Whereas epilepsy suggests quite the reverse, a crude, random physiological event, wholly unselective, without feeling or meaning. Thus, a musical epilepsy or a personal epilepsy would seem a contradiction in terms. And yet, such epilepsies do occur, though solely in the context of temporal lobe seizures, epilepsies of reminiscent part of the brain. Hewling Jackson described these a century ago and spoke in this context of dreamy states, reminiscence, and physical seizures. It is not very uncommon for epileptics to have vague and yet exceedingly elaborate mental states at the onset of epileptic seizures. The elaborate mental state, or so-called intellectual aura, is always the same or essentially the same in each case. Hi, MJ. How you doing? Such descriptions remain purely anecdotal until the extraordinary studies of Wilder Penfield half a century later. Penfield was not only able to locate their origin in the temporal lobes, but was able to evoke the elaborate mental state or the extremely precise and detailed experiential hallucinations of such seizures by gentle electrical stimulation of the seizure-prone points of the cerebral cortex, as this was exposed at surgery in fully conscious patients. Such stimulations would instantly call forth intensely vivid hallucinations of tunes, people, scenes, which would be experienced, lived as compellingly real in spite of the prosaic atmosphere of the operating room, and could be described to those present in fascinating detail, confirming what Jackson described 60 years earlier when he spoke of the characteristic doubling of consciousness. There is one, the quasi-parasitical state of consciousness, a dreamy state, and two, there are remains of normal consciousness, and thus there is double consciousness, a mental diplopia. This was precisely expressed to me by my two patients, Mrs. O.M. Mrs. O.M. heard me and saw me, albeit with some difficulty, through the deafening dream of Easter parade, or the quieter yet more profound dream of Good Night, Sweet Jesus, which called up for her the presence of a church she used to go to on 31st Street, where this was always sung after novena. And Mrs. O.C. also saw and heard me, though the much profounder anamnestic, I hate it when they do anamnestic, there we go, seizure of her childhood in Ireland. I know you're there, Dr. Sachs. I know I'm an old woman with a stroke in an old people's home, but I feel I'm a child in Ireland again. I feel my mother's arms, I see her, and I hear her voice singing. Such epileptic hallucinations or dreams, Penfield showed, are never fantasies. They are always memories, and memories of the most precise and vivid kind, accompanied by emotions which accompanied the original experience. Their extraordinary and consistent detail, which is evoked each time the cortex was stimulated and exceeded anything which could be recalled by ordinary memory, suggested to Penfield that the brain retained an almost perfect record of every lifetime's experience, that the total stream of consciousness was preserved in the brain, and as such could always be evoked or called forth, whether by the ordinary needs and circumstances of life or by the extraordinary circumstances of an epileptic or electrical stimulation. The variety, the absurdity of such convulsive memories and scenes made Penfield think that such reminiscence was essentially meaningless and random. At operation, it is usually quite clear that the evoked experiential response is a random reproduction of whatever composed the stream of consciousness during some interval of the patient's past life. It may have been, Penfield continues, summarizing the extraordinary miscellany of epileptic dreams and scenes he has evoked. It may have been a time of listening to music, a time of looking in at the door of a dance hall, a time of imagining the action of robbers from a comic strip, a time of waking from a vivid dream, a time of laughing conversation with friends, a time of listening to a little son to make sure he was safe, a time of watching illuminated signs, a time of lying in the delivery room at birth, a time of being frightened by a menacing man, a time of watching people enter the room with snow on their clothes. It may have been a time of standing on the corner of Jacob and Washington, South Bend, Indiana, of watching a circus wagons one night years ago in childhood, a time of listening to and watching your mother speed the parting guests, or of hearing your father and mother singing Christmas carols. I wish I could quote in its entirety this wonderful passage from Penfield and Perrault's massive paper. It gives, as my Irish ladies do, an amazing feeling of personal physiology, the physiology of self. Penfield is impressed by the frequency of musical seizures and gives many fascinating and often funny examples, a 3% incidence in the more than 500 temporal lobe epileptics he has studied. We were surprised at the number of times electrical stimulation has caused the patient to hear music. It was produced from 17 different points in 11 cases, the illustration on the next page. Sometimes it was an orchestra, at other times voices ringing, or a piano playing, or a choir. Several times it was said to be a radio theme song. The localization for production of music is in the superior temporal convolution, either the lateral or superior surface, and as such, close to the point associated with so-called musicogenic epilepsy. This is borne out dramatically and often comically by the examples Penfield gives. The following list is extracted from his final paper. White Christmas, Case 4, sung by a choir. Rolling Along Together, Case 5, not identified by patient, but recognized by operating room nurse when patient hummed it on stimulation. All right. Okay, where did I put it? Okay, it's the illustration. So we were surprised at the number of times electrical stimulation has caused the patient to hear music. It was produced from 17 different points in 11 cases. And this is the illustration on the next page. Okay, it's very tiny and it's black and white. There we go. So I'll leave that up for a few more seconds. If you want to come back to it and pause later to read it, you can. Hi, Linda. How you doing? So Hushabye Baby, Case 6, sung by a mother, but also thought to be a theme tune for a radio program. A song he had heard before, a popular one on the radio, was Case 10. Oh Marie, was Case 30, the theme song of a radio program. The War March of the Priests, Case 31. This was on the other side of the Hallelujah chorus on a record belonging to the patient. Mother and Father Singing Christmas Carols was Case 32. Music from Guys and Dolls in Case 37. A song she had heard frequently on the radio was Case 45. I'll Get By and You'll Never Know, Case 46, were songs he had often heard on the radio. In each case, as with Mrs. O.M., the music was fixed and stereotyped. The same tune or tunes were heard again and again, whether in the course of spontaneous seizures or with electrical stimulation of the seizure-prone cortex. Thus, These tunes were not only popular on the radio, but equally popular as hallucinatory seizures. They were, so to speak, the top 10 of the cortex. Is there any reason we must wonder why particular songs or scenes are selected by particular patients for reproduction in their hallucinatory seizures? Penfield considers this question and feels that there is no reason and certainly no significance in the selection involved. It would be very difficult to imagine that some of the trivial incidents in songs recalled during stimulation or epileptic discharge could have any possible emotional significance to the patient, even if one is acutely aware of this possibility. The selection, he concludes, is quite at random, except that there is some evidence of cortical conditioning. These are the words, and this is the attitude, so to speak, of physiology. Perhaps Penfield is right, but could there be more? Is he in fact acutely aware enough, at the levels that matter, of the possible emotional significance of songs, of what Thomas Mann called the world behind the music? Would superficial questioning, such as, does this song have any special meaning to you, suffice? We know all too well from the study of free associations that the most seemingly trivial or random thoughts may turn out to have an unexpected depth and resonance. but that this only becomes evident given an analysis in depth. Clearly, there is no such deep analysis in Penfield, nor in any other physiological psychology. It is not clear whether any such deep analysis is needed, but given the extraordinary opportunity of such a miscellany of convulsive songs and scenes, one feels at least that it should be given a try. I've gone back to Mrs. O.M. briefly to elicit her associations, her feelings to her songs. This may be unnecessary, but I think it worth trying. One important thing has already emerged. Although consciously she cannot attribute to the three songs special feeling or meaning, she now recalls, and this is confirmed by others, that she was apt to hum them unconsciously long before they became hallucinatory seizures. This suggests that they were already unconsciously selected, a selection which was then seized on by a supervening organic pathology. That's interesting. Are they still her favorites? Did they matter to her now? Does she get anything out of her hallucinatory music? The month after I saw Mrs. O.M., there was an article in the New York Times entitled, "Did Shostakovich Have a Secret?" The secret of Shostakovich, it was suggested by a Chinese neurologist, Dr. Daiju Wang, was the presence of a metallic splinter, a mobile shell fragment in his brain, in the temporal horn of the left ventricle. Shostakovich was very reluctant, apparently, to have this removed. Since the fragment had been there, he said, each time he leaned his head to one side, he could hear music. His head was filled with melodies, different each time, which he then made use of when composing. X-rays allegedly showed that the fragment moving around when Shostakovich moved his head, pressing against his musical temporal lobe when he tilted, producing an infinity of melodies which his genius could use. Dr. R.A. Henson, editor of Music and the Brain, expressed deep but not absolute skepticism. I would hesitate to affirm that it could not happen. After reading the article, I gave it to Mrs. O.M. to read, and her reactions were strong and clear. I am no Shostakovich, she said. I can't use my songs. Anyhow, I'm tired of them. They're always the same. Musical hallucinations may have been a gift to Shostakovich, but they are only a nuisance to me. He didn't want treatment, but I want it badly. I put Mrs. O.M. on anticonvulsants, and she forthwith ceased her musical convulsions. I saw her again recently and asked her if she missed him. Not on your life, she said. I am much better now without them. But this, as we have seen, was not the case with Mrs. O.C., whose hallucinosis was an altogether more complex, more mysterious, and deeper kind, even if random in its causation, turned out to have great psychological significance and use. With Mrs. O.C., indeed, the epilepsy was different from the start, both in terms of physiology and of personal character and impact. There was, for the first 72 hours, an almost continuous seizure or seizure status associated with an apoplexy of the temporal lobe. This in itself was overwhelming. Secondly, and this too has some physiological basis in the abruptness and extent of the stroke, and its disturbance of deep-lying emotional centers, uncus, amygdala, limbic system, etc., deep within and deep to the temporal lobe. There was an overwhelming emotion associated with the seizures and an overwhelming and profoundly nostalgic content. An overwhelming sense of being a child again in her long-forgotten home in the arms and presence of her mother. It may be that such seizures have both physiological and personal origin, coming from particular charged parts of that brain, but equally meeting particular psychic circumstances and needs, as in a case reported by Dennis Williams in a 1956 paper. A representative, 30, case 2770, had major epilepsy induced by finding himself alone among strangers. Onset, a visual memory of his parents at home, the feeling, how marvelous to be back. It is described as a very pleasant memory. He gets goose skin, goes hot and cold, and either the attack subsides or proceeds to a convulsion. Williams relates this astounding story baldly and makes no connection between any of its parts. The emotion is dismissed as purely physiological, inappropriate ictal pleasure, and the possible relation of being back home to being lonely is equally ignored. He may, of course, be right. Perhaps it all is entirely physiological, but I cannot help thinking that if one has to have seizures, this man, case 2770, managed to have the right seizures at the right time. In Mrs. O.C.'s case, the nostalgic need was more chronic and profound, for her father died before she was born, and her mother before she was 5. Orphaned, alone, she was sent to America to live with a rather forbidding maiden aunt. Mrs. O.C. had no conscious memory of the first 5 years of her life, no memory of her mother, of Ireland, of home. She had always felt this as a keen and painful sadness. This lack or forgetting of the earliest, most precious years of her life. She had often tried but never succeeded to recapture her lost and forgotten childhood memories. Now, with her dream, and the long, dreamy state which succeeded it, she recaptured a crucial sense of her forgotten, lost childhood. The feeling she had was not just ictal pleasure, but a trembling, profound, and poignant joy. It was, as she said, like the opening of a door which had been stubbornly closed all her life. In her beautiful book on involuntary memories, a collection of moments, Esther Salaman speaks of the necessity to preserve or recapture the sacred and precious memories of childhood, and how impoverished, ungrounded life is without these. She speaks of the deep joy, the sense of reality, which recapturing such memories may give, and she provides an abundance of marvelous autobiographical quotations, especially from Dostoevsky and Proust. We are all exiles from our past, she writes, and as such, we need to recapture it. For Mrs. O.C., nearly 90, approaching the end of a long, lonely life, this recapturing of sacred and precious childhood memories, this strange and almost miraculous anamnestin, fudge. I just said it earlier too. Anamnesis. There we go. Anamnesis. I don't know why I could do it before and not now. Either way, the strange and almost miraculous anamnesis, breaking open the closed door, the amnesia of childhood, was provided paradoxically by cerebral mishap. Unlike Mrs. O.M., who found her seizures exhausting and tiresome, Mrs. O.C. found hers a refreshment to the spirit. They gave her a sense of psychological grounding in reality, the elemental sense that she had lost in her long decades of cut-offness and exile. That she had had a real childhood and home, that she had been mothered and loved and cared for. Unlike Mrs. O.M., who wanted treatment, Mrs. O.C. declined anticonvulsants. I need these memories, she would say. I need what's going on, and it'll end by itself soon enough. Yeah, I don't have very many. I have a few, like, almost more like vivid snapshots of moments from my early childhood. But that's about it. I can't really remember a whole lot. Trauma response to something in your past. Could be. You never know. Dostoevsky had physical seizures or elaborate mental states at the onset of seizures, and once said of these, "You all, healthy people, can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our fit. I don't know if this felicity lasts for seconds, hours, or months, but believe me, I would not exchange it for all the joys that life may bring." Mrs. O.C. would have understood this. She too knew, in her seizures, an extraordinary felicity, but it seemed to her the acme of sanity and health, the very key, indeed the door, to sanity and health. Thus she felt her illness as health, as healing. As she got better and recovered from her stroke, Mrs. O.C. had a period of wistfulness and fear. "The door is closing," she said, "and I'm losing it all again." And indeed she did lose, by the middle of April, the sudden eruptions of childhood scenes and music and feeling. Her sudden epileptic transports back to the world of early childhood, which were undoubtedly reminiscences and authentic, for as Penfield had shown beyond doubt, such seizures grasp and reproduce a reality, an experiential reality, and not a fantasy, actual segments of an individual's lifetime and past experience. But Penfield always speaks of the consciousness in this regard, of physical seizures as seizing and convulsively replaying part of the stream of consciousness, of conscious reality. What is peculiarly important and moving in the case of Mrs. O.C. is that epileptic reminiscence here seized on something unconscious. Very early childhood experiences either faded or repressed from consciousness and restored them convulsively to full memory and consciousness. And it is for this reason one must suppose that though physiologically the door did close, the experience itself was not forgotten, but left a profound and enduring impression and was felt as a significant and healing experience. "I'm glad it happened," she said when it was over. "It was the healthiest, happiest experience of my life. There's no longer a great chunk of childhood missing. I can't remember the details now, but I know it's all there. There's a sort of completeness I never had before." These were not idle words, but brave and true. Mrs. O.C.'s seizures did effect a kind of conversion, did give a center to a centerless life, and did give her back the childhood she had lost. And with this, a serenity which she had never had before and which remained for the rest of her life. An ultimate serenity and security of spirit, as is only given to those who possess or recall the true past. Postscript. I have never been consulted for reminiscence only, said Hewling Jackson. In contrast, Freud said neurosis is reminiscence. But clearly the word is being used in quite opposite senses. For the aim of psychoanalysis, one might say, is to replace false or fantastic reminiscences by a true memory or amnesia, anamnesis. Why? By a true memory or anamnesis of the past. And it is precisely such true memory, trivial or profound, that is evoked in the course of psychical seizures. Freud, we know, greatly admired Jackson, but we do not know if Jackson, who lived to 1911, had ever heard of Freud. The beauty of a case like Mrs. O'C's is that it is at once Jacksonian and Freudian. She suffered from a Jacksonian reminiscence, but this served to moor and heal her as a Freudian anamnesis. Such cases are exciting and precious, for they serve as a bridge between the physical and personal, and they will point, if we let them, to the neurology of the future, a neurology of living experience. This would not, I think, have surprised or outraged Hewling Jackson. Indeed, it is surely what he himself dreamed of when he wrote of dreamy states and reminiscence back in 1880. Penfield and Perot entitled their paper The Brain's Record of Visual and Auditory Experience, and we may now meditate on the form or forms such inner records may have. What occurs in these wholly personal experiential seizures is an entire replay of a segment of experience. What, we may ask, could be played in such a way as to reconstitute the experience? Is it something akin to a film or record played on the brain's film projector or phonograph? Or something analogous but logically anterior, such as a script or score? What is the final form, the natural form of our life's repertoire? That repertoire which provides not only memory and reminiscence, but our imagination at every level, from the simplest sensory and motor images to the most complex imaginative worlds, landscapes, and scenes. A repertoire, a memory, an imagination of a life which is essentially personal, dramatic, and iconic. The experiences of reminiscence our patients have raise fundamental questions about the nature of memory or mnesis. These are also raised in reverse in our tales of amnesia or amnesis, as in The Lost Mariner or A Matter of Identity. Analogous questions about the nature of knowing, or gnosis, are raised by our patients with agnosias. The dramatic visual agnosia of Dr. P, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and the auditory musical agnosias of Mrs. O.M. or Emily D. in the President's speech. And similar questions about the nature of action or praxis are raised by the motor bewilderment or apraxia of certain retardates, and by patients with frontal lobe apraxias which may be so severe that such patients may be unable to walk, may lose their kinetic melodies, their melodies of walking. This also happens in Parkinsonian patients, as was seen in Awakenings. As Mrs. O.C. and Mrs. O.M. suffered from reminiscence, a convulsive upsurge of melodies and scenes, a sort of hypermnesia and hypergnosis, our amnesic agnosic patients have lost or are losing their inner melodies and scenes. Both alike testify to the essentially melodic and scenic nature of inner life, the Proustian nature of memory and mind. Stimulate a point in the cortex of such a patient, and there convulsively unrolls a Proustian evocation and reminiscence. What mediates this, we wonder? What sort of cerebral organization could allow this to happen? Our current concepts of cerebral processing and representation are all essentially computational. See, for example, David Marr's brilliant 1982 book, Vision, the computational investigation of visual representation in man. And as such, they are couched in terms of schemata, programs, algorithms, etc. But could schemata, programs, algorithms alone provide for us the richly visionary, dramatic, and musical quality of experience? That vivid personal quality which makes it experience? The answer is clearly, even passionately, no. Computational representations, even of the exquisite sophistication envisaged by Marr and Bernstein, the two greatest pioneers and thinkers in this realm, could never of themselves constitute iconic representations, those representations which are the very thread and stuff of life. Thus a gulf appears, indeed a chasm, between what we learn from our patients and what physiologists tell us. Is there any way of bridging this chasm? Or, if that is, as it may be, categorically impossible, are there any concepts beyond those of cybernetics by which we may better understand the essentially personal Proustian nature of reminiscence of the mind, of life? Can we, in short, have a personal or Proustian physiology over and above the mechanical Sherringtonian one? Sherrington himself hints at this in Man on His Nature, when he imagines the mind as an enchanted loom, weaving ever-changing yet always meaningful patterns, weaving, in effect, patterns of meaning. Such patterns of meaning would indeed transcend purely formal or computational programs or patterns, and allow the essentially personal quality which is inherent in reminiscence, inherent in all gnosis, and praxis. And if we ask what form, what organization such patterns could have, the answer springs immediately and, as it were, inevitably to mind. Personal patterns, patterns for the individual, would have to take the form of scripts or scores, just as abstract patterns, patterns for a computer, must take the form of schemata or programs. Thus, above the level of cerebral programs, we must conceive a level of cerebral scripts and scores. The score of Easter Parade, I conjecture, is indelibly inscribed on Mrs. O.M.'s brain. The score, her score, of all she heard and felt at that original moment, and imprinting of the experience. Similarly, the dramaturgic portions of Mrs. O.C.'s brain, apparently forgotten but nonetheless totally recoverable, must have lain indelibly inscribed in the script of her dramatic childhood scene. And let us note from Penfield's cases that the removal of the minute convulsing point of cortex, the irritant focus causing reminiscence, can remove in toto the iterating scene and replace an absolutely specific reminiscence or hypermnesia by an equally specific oblivion or amnesia. There's something extremely important and frightening here: the possibility of a real psychosurgery, a neurosurgery of identity, infinitely finer and more specific than our gross amputations and lobotomies, which may damp or deform the whole character but cannot touch individual experiences. Experience is not possible until it is organized iconically. Action is not possible unless it is organized. Until it is organized iconically. And action is not possible unless it is organized iconically. The brain's record of everything everything alive, must be iconic. This is the final form of the brain's record, even though the preliminary form may be computational or programmatic. The final form of cerebral representation must be, or allow, art, the artful scenery and melody of experience and action. By the same token, if the brain's representations are damaged or destroyed, as in the amnesias, agnosias, apraxias, and their reconstitution, if possible, demands a double approach. An attempt to reconstruct damaged programs and systems, as is being developed extraordinarily by Soviet neuropsychology, interesting, or a direct approach at the level of inner melodies and scenes, as described in Awakenings, A Leg to Stand On, and several cases in this book, especially Rebecca and the introduction to Part 4. Either approach may be used, or both may be used in conjunction. If we are to understand or assist brain-damaged patients, a systematic therapy and an art therapy, preferably both. All of this was hinted at 100 years ago in Hewlin Jackson's original 1880 account of Reminiscence by Korsakov on amnesia in 1887 and by Freud and Anton in Agnosias in the 1890s. Their remarkable insights have been half forgotten, eclipsed by the rise of a systematic physiology. Now is the time to recall them, reuse them, so that they may arise in our own time, a new and beautiful existential science and therapy, which can join with the systematic to give us a comprehensive understanding and power. Since the original publication of this book, I have been consulted for innumerable cases of musical reminiscence. It is evidently not uncommon, especially in the elderly, though fear may inhibit the seeking of advice. Occasionally, as with Mrs. O.C. and Mrs. O.M., a serious or significant pathology is found. Occasionally, as in a recent case report in the New England Journal of Medicine, September 5th, 1985, there is a toxic basis, such as the overuse of aspirin. Patients with severe nerve deafness may have musical phantoms, but in most cases, no pathology can be found, and the condition, though a nuisance, is essentially benign. Why the musical parts of the brain, above all, should be so prone to such releases in old age remains far from clear. Hello, Island. You're welcome. Chapter 16, Incontinent Nostalgia. If I encountered reminiscence occasionally in the context of epilepsy or migraine, I encountered it commonly in my post-encephalitic patients excited by L-DOPA. So much so that I found myself calling L-DOPA a sort of strange and personal time machine. It was so dramatic in one patient that I made her the subject of a letter to the editor, published in The Lancet in June 1970. Here I found myself thinking of reminiscence in its strict Jacksonian sense, as a convulsive upsurge of memories from a remote past. Later, when I came to write the history of this patient, Rose R., in Awakenings, I thought less in terms of reminiscence and more in terms of stoppage. Has she never moved on from 1926, I wrote? And these are the terms in which Harold Pinter portrays Deborah in A Kind of Alaska. In my letter to The Lancet, I wrote, one of the most astonishing effects of L-DOPA when given to certain post-encephalitic patients is the reactivation of symptoms and behavior patterns present at a much earlier stage of the disease, but subsequently lost. We have already commented in this connection on the exacerbation or recurrence of respiratory crises, oculogeric crises, interrative hyperkineses, and tics. We have also observed the reactivation of many other dormant primitive symptoms, such as myoclonus, bulimia, polydipsia, satyriasis, central pain, forced effects, etc. At still higher levels of function, we have seen the return and reactivation of elaborate, effectively charged moral postures, thought systems, dreams, and memories, all forgotten, repressed, or otherwise inactivated in the limbo of profoundly akinetic and sometimes apathetic post-encephalitic illness. A striking example of forced reminiscence induced by L-DOPA was seen in the case of a 63-year-old woman who had had progressive post-encephalitic Parkinsonianism since the age of 18, holy Hannah, and had been institutionalized in a state of almost continuous oculogeric trance for 24 years. Wow. L-DOPA produced, at first, a dramatic release from her Parkinsonianism and oculogeric entrancement, allowing almost normal speech and movement. Soon there followed, as in several of our patients, a psychomotor excitement with increased libido. This period was marked by nostalgia, joyful identification with the youthful self, an uncontrollable upsurge of remote sexual memories and illusions. The patient requested a tape recorder, and in the course of a few days recorded innumerable salacious songs, dirty jokes, and limericks, all derived from party gossip, smutty comics, nightclubs, and music halls in the middle and late 1920s. These recitals were enlivened by repeated allusions to then contemporary events and the use of obsolete colloquialisms, intonations, and social mannerisms irresistibly evocative of that bygone flappers era. Nobody was more astonished than the patient herself. "It's amazing," she said. "I can't understand it. I haven't heard or thought of those things for more than 40 years. I never knew I still knew them. But now they keep running through my mind. Now they keep running through my mind." Increasing excitement necessitated a reduction of the dosage of L-DOPA, and with this patient, although remaining quite articulate, instantly forgot all these early memories and was never again able to recall a single line of the song she had recorded. Forced reminiscence, usually associated with a sense of déjà vu, and in Jackson's term, a doubling of consciousness, occurs rather commonly in attacks of migraine and epilepsy in hypnotic and psychotic states, and less dramatically, in everybody in response to the powerful mnemonic stimulus of certain words, sounds, scenes, and especially smells. A sudden memory upsurge has been described as occurring in oculogeric crises, as in a case described by Zutt, in which thousands of memories suddenly crowded into the patient's mind. Penfield and Perot have been able to evoke stereotyped recalls by stimulating epileptogenic points in the cortex, and surmise that naturally occurring or artificially induced seizures occurring in such a patient activate fossilized memory sequences in the brain. We surmise that our patient, like everybody, is stacked with an almost infinite number of dormant memory traces, some of which can be reactivated under special conditions, especially conditions of overwhelming excitement. Such traces we conceive, like the subcortical imprints of remote events far below the horizon of mental life, are indelibly etched in the nervous system and may persist indefinitely in a state of abeyance, due either to lack of excitation or to positive inhibition. The effects of their excitation or disinhibition may, of course, be identical and mutually provocative. We doubt, however, whether it is adequate to speak of our patients' memories as having been simply repressed, during her illness and then depressed in response to L-DOPA. The forced reminiscence induced by L-DOPA, cortical probes, migraines, epilepsies, crises, etc., would seem to be primarily an excitation, while the incontinently nostalgic reminiscence of old age and sometimes of drunkenness seem closer to a disinhibition and uncovering of archaic traces. All of these states can release memory, and all of them can lead to a re-experience and reenactment of the past. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, Linda. The L-DOPA stuff is kind of miraculous. I've never heard of it before. It's very interesting. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay, we'll do chapter 17 as well, and that should bring us up roughly to the 2-hour mark, and then we can call it a day. But yeah, I'm going to have to look into this L-DOPA. Sounds really amazing. So, chapter 17, A Passage to India. Bhagawandi P., an Indian girl of 19 with a malignant brain tumor, was admitted to our hospice in 1978. The tumor, an astrocytoma, had first presented when she was 7, but was then of low malignancy and well circumscribed, allowing a complete resection and a complete return of function, and allowing Bhagawandi to return to normal life. Awakenings is heartbreaking. Yeah. I really enjoyed the let me just make sure. Yeah, I think it was Tiki Wiki Ray. With the Tourette's, he ended up enjoying the use of L-DOPA throughout the work week when he had to, go to work and do normal stuff. But he chose to not take it on the weekends so that he could get his wittiness, his banter, his self back on the weekends. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Oh, okay. Okay. They're all mixing in my head already. But yeah, I really liked that they that he was able to pick and choose times and make the most out of his illness, Like some of them have stated it might be an illness or an injury that's caused it, but not all of them want to get rid of it. There's a few of them that have said that they actually appreciate the effects, which is kind of cool. All right. So Bhagwani P., she had an astrocytoma, which had first presented when she was 7, but was then of low malignancy and well circumscribed, allowing a complete resection and a complete return of function, and allowing Bhagwandi to return to normal life. This reprieve lasted for 10 years, during which she lived life to the full, lived it gratefully and consciously to the full, for she knew she was a bright girl, that she had a time bomb in her head. In her 18th year, the tumor reoccurred, much more invasive and malignant now, and was no longer removable. A decompression was performed to allow its expansion, and it was with weakness and numbness of the left side, with occasional seizures and other problems, Bhagawandi was admitted. It slows the decline of efficacy. Okay, interesting. Right, AP? I'd love to get rid of my neuro disorder anytime now. Right? Oh, Mao. What do you need? Sorry. Hi, come here. Hello. What do you want? What do you want? Okay, don't sit on the keyboard. Well, you were going to climb right over me. No? Okay. Your mom takes the mixture of the two for her Parkinson's. Okay. Interesting. And she also takes breaks from them. Okay. And that's to help with the help keep it working for longer. She was at first remarkably cheerful, seeming to accept fully the fate which lay in store, but still eager to be with people and do things, enjoy an experience as long as she could. As the tumor inched forward to her temporal lobe and the decompression started to bulge, we put her on steroids to reduce cerebral edema. Her seizures became more frequent and stranger. Interesting. Yeah, it's similar in how the medicinal marijuana works, because I use it so often. You build up a tolerance, so you have to decrease or stop at times to allow your tolerance to go back down. Because every time your tolerance goes back down, it doesn't go all the way down. It's always a little bit higher than the last time you took it down. So you're still going to eventually build that full tolerance. But it's interesting that she's able to do that with those meds. Yeah, I've got questions, but I'll leave it for a day when I'm not reading. The original seizures were grand mal convulsions, and these she continued to have on occasion. Her new ones had a different character altogether. She would not lose consciousness, but she would look and feel dreamy. It was easy to ascertain and confirmed by EEG that she was now having frequent temporal lobe seizures, which, as Hewling Jackson taught, are often characterized by dreamy states and involuntary reminiscence. Soon, this vague dreaminess took on a more defined, more concrete, more visionary character. It now took the form of visions of India, landscapes, villages, homes, gardens, which Bhagawandi recognized at once as places she had known and loved as a child. Do these distress you? We asked. We can change the medication. No, she said with a peaceful smile. I like these dreams. They take me back home. At times there were people, usually her family or neighbors from her home village. Sometimes there was speech or singing and dancing. Once she was in church, once in a graveyard, but mostly there were the plains, the fields, the rice paddies near her village, and the low, sweet hills which swept up to the horizon. Were these all temporal lobe seizures? This first seemed the case, but now we were less sure. For temporal lobe seizures, as Hewling Jackson emphasized, and Wilder Penfield was able, by stimulation of the exposed brain, to confirm, the reminiscence, tend to have a rather fixed format, a single scene or song, unvaryingly reiterated, going with an equally fixed focus in the cortex. Whereas Bhagwandi's dreams had no such fixity, but presented ever-changing panoramas and dissolving landscapes to her eye. Was she then toxic and hallucinating from massive doses of steroids she was now receiving? Hello, Helen. How you doing? This seemed possible, but we could not reduce the steroids. She would have gone into coma and died within days. And as steroid psychosis, so-called, is often excited and disorganized, whereas Bhagwandi was always lucid, peaceful and calm. Could they be, in the Freudian sense, fantasies or dreams? or the sort of dream madness, oneirofrenia, which may sometimes occur in schizophrenia. Here again, we could not be certain, for though there was a phantasmagoria of sorts, yet the phantasms were clearly all memories. They occurred side by side with normal awareness and consciousness. Hewling Jackson, as we have seen, speaks of a doubling of consciousness. And they were not obviously cathected. Okay. They were not obviously over-cathected or charged with passionate drives. They seemed more like certain paintings or tone poems, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, evocations, revocations, visitations to and from a loved and cherished childhood. Day by day, week by week, the dreams, the visions came oftener, grew deeper. They were not occasional now, but occupied most of the day. We would see her wrapped as if in a trance, her eyes sometimes closed, sometimes open but unseeing, and always a faint, mysterious smile on her face. If anyone approached her or asked her something, as the nurses had to do, she would respond at once, lucidly and courteously, but there was, even among the most down-to-earth staff, a feeling that she was in another world and that we should not interrupt her. I shared this feeling, and though curious, was reluctant to probe. Once, just once, I said, "Bhagwandi, what is happening?" "I am dying," she answered. "I am going home. I am going back where I came from. You might call it my return." Another week passed, and now Bhagwandi no longer responded to external stimuli, but seemed wholly enveloped in a world of her own. And though her eyes were closed, her face still bore its faint, happy smile. "She's on the return journey," the staff said, "and she'll soon be there." 3 days later, she died, or should we say she arrived, having completed her passage to India. Well, that went a lot quicker than I thought. I'll keep reading one more. Try to keep it to the 2-hour mark, eh? Oh, I was curious about this one anyways. This is chapter 18 called The Dog Beneath the Skin. Stephen D., age 22, medical student, on highs, cocaine, PCP, chiefly amphetamines. Vivid dream one night, dreamt he was a dog in a world unimaginably rich with and significant in smells. The brilliant smell of water, the brave smell of a stone. Waking, he found himself in just such a world, as if I had been totally colorblind before, and suddenly found myself in a world full of color. He did, in fact, have an enhancement of color vision. I could distinguish dozens of browns where I had just seen brown before. My leather-bound books, which looked similar before, now all had quite distinct or indistinguishable hues, and a dramatic enhancement of eidetic visual perception and memory. I could never draw before. I couldn't see things in my mind. But now it was like having a camera lucida in my mind. I saw everything as if projected onto the paper, and just drew the outlines I saw. Suddenly, I could do the most accurate anatomical drawings. But it was the exaltation of smell which really transformed his world. I had dreamt I was a dog. It was an olfactory dream. And now I awoke to an infinitely redolent world, a world in which all other sensations, enhanced as they were, paled before smell. And with all this, there was a sort of trembling, eager emotion, and a strange nostalgia, as if of a lost world, half forgotten and half recalled. Somewhat similar states, a strange emotionalism, sometimes nostalgia, reminiscence, and deja vu associated with intense olfactory hallucinations, are characteristic of Eucynid seizures, a form of temporal lobe epilepsy first described by Hewling Jackson about a century ago. Usually the experience is rather specific, but sometimes there is a generalized intensification of smell, a hyperosmia. The uncus phylogenetically part of the ancient smell brain, or rhinoencephalon, is functionally associated with the whole limbic system, which is increasingly recognized to be crucial in determining and regulating the entire emotional tone. Excitation of this, by whatever means, produces heightened emotionalism. I know, hello. And an intensification of the senses. Ow, ow, ow. Thank you. Excitation of this, by whatever means, produces heightened emotionalism and an intensification of the senses. The entire subject, with its intriguing ramifications, have been explored in great detail by David Baer. Are you coming back now? Hi. Sorry, you guys. Hi, neurodivergent. Good to see you over on the Rumble. Thank you. I went into a scent shop, he continued. I'd never had much of a nose for smells before, but now I distinguished each one instantly. And I found each one unique, evocative, and a whole world. He found he could distinguish all his friends and patients by smell. I went into the clinic, I sniffed like a dog, and in that sniff recognized, before seeing them, the 20 patients who were there. Each had his own olfactory physiognomy, thank you. A smell face, far more vivid and evocative, more redolent than any sight face. He could smell their emotions, fear, contentment, sexuality, like a dog. He could recognize every street, every shop by smell, and he could find his way around New York infallibly by smell. That's pretty awesome. He experienced a certain impulse to sniff and touch everything. It wasn't really real until I felt it and smelt it. But he suppressed this when with others, lest he seem inappropriate. Sexual smells were exciting and increased, but no more so, he felt, than food smells or other smells. Smell pleasure was intense, and smell displeasure too. But it seemed to him less a world of mere pleasure and displeasure than a whole aesthetic, a whole judgment, a whole new significance which surrounded him. It was a world overwhelmingly concrete of particulars, he said, a world overwhelming in immediacy, in immediate significance. Somewhat intellectual before and inclined to reflection and abstraction, he now found thought, abstraction, and categorization somewhat difficult and unreal in view of the compelling immediacy of each experience. Rather suddenly, after 3 weeks, this strange transformation ceased. His sense of smell, all of his senses, returned to normal. He found himself back with a sense of mingled loss and relief in his old world of pallor, sensory faintness, non-concreteness, and abstraction. I'm glad to be back, he said, but it's a tremendous loss too. I see now what we give up in being civilized and human. We need the other, the primitive as well. 16 years have passed, and student days and amphetamine days are long over. There has never been any recurrence of anything remotely similar. Dr. D is a highly successful young internist, a friend and colleague of mine in New York. He has no regrets, but he is occasionally nostalgic. That smell world, that world of redolence, he explained. So vivid and so real. It was like a visit to another world, a world of pure perception, rich, alive, self-sufficient, and full. If only I could go back sometimes and be a dog again. Freud wrote on several occasions of a man's sense of smell as being a casualty, repressed in growing up and civilization, with the assumption of an upright posture and the repression of primitive pregenital sexuality. Specific and pathological enhancements of smell have indeed been reported as occurring in paraphilia, fetishism, and allied perversions and regressions. This is well described in a 1932 paper by A. Brill and contrasted with the overall brilliance, the redolence of the smell world in macrosomatic animals such as dogs, savages, and children. Where did that? But the disinhibition here described seems far more general, and though associated with excitement, probably an amphetamine-induced dopaminergic excitation, was neither specifically sexual nor associated with sexual regression. Similar hypersomnia, another one, I just said it. Hyperosmia, sometimes paroxysmal, may occur in excited dopaminergic states, as with some post-anxiolytics on L-Dopa and some patients with Tourette syndrome. What we see, if nothing else, is the universality of inhibition, even at the most elemental and perceptual level. The need to inhibit what Head regarded as primordial and full of feeling tone and called protopathic, in order to allow the emergence of the sophisticated, categorizing, affectless epicritic. The need for such inhibition cannot be reduced to the Freudian, nor should its reduction be exalted, romanticized to the Blakean. Perhaps we need it, as Head implies, that we may be men and not dogs. See Jonathan Miller's 1970 critique of Head, entitled The Dog Beneath the Skin, in The Listener. And yet Stephen D's experience reminds us, like G.K. Chesterton's poem, The Song of Quoodle, that sometimes we need to be dogs and not men. They haven't got no noses, the fallen sons of Eve, oh, for the brilliant smell of water, the brave smell of a stone. Postscript. I have recently encountered a sort of corollary of this case, a gifted man who sustained a head injury, severely damaging his olfactory tracts. These are very vulnerable in their long course across the anterior fossa, and in consequence, entirely losing his sense of smell. He has been startled and distressed at the effects of this. Sense of smell, he says, I never gave it a thought. You don't normally give it a thought, but when I lost it, it was like being struck blind. Life lost a good deal of its savor. One doesn't realize how much savor is smell. You smell people, you smell books, you smell the city, you smell the spring. Maybe not consciously, but as a rich, unconscious background to everything else. My whole world was suddenly radically poorer. There was an acute sense of loss, an acute sense of yearning, a veritable osmalgia, a desire to remember the smell world to which he had paid no conscious attention, but which he now felt had formed the very ground base of life. And then, some months later, to his astonishment and joy, his favorite morning coffee, which had become insipid, started to regain its savor. Tentatively, he tried his pipe, not touched for months, and here too caught a hint of the rich aroma he loved. Greatly excited, the neurologist had held out no hope of recovery. He returned to his doctor, but after testing him minutely, using a double-blind technique, his doctor said, "No, I'm sorry, there's no trace of recovery. You still have a total anosmia. Curious, though, that you thought that you should now smell your pipe and coffee." What seems to be happening, and it is important that it was only the olfactory tracts and not the cortex, which were damaged, is the development of a greatly enhanced olfactory imagery, almost, one might say, a controlled hallucinosis, so that in drinking his coffee or lighting his pipe, situations normally and previously fraught with the associations of smell, he is now able to evoke or re-evoke these unconsciously, and with such intensity as to think at first that they are real. This power, part conscious and part unconscious, has intensified and spread. Now, for example, he snuffs and smells the spring. At least he calls up a smell memory or a smell picture so intense that he can almost deceive himself and deceive others into believing that he truly smells it. We know that such a compensation often occurs with the blind and the deaf. We think of deaf Beethoven and the blinded Prescott. But I have no idea whether it is common with anosmia. There we go. That gets me a lot closer to the 2-hour mark. Freud had his own museum here in Vienna. I know. I would love to go and tour that at some point. That would have been really cool to see. He's the father of psychotherapy, but many of his hypotheses have been debunked. Also, you have to understand that he was a drug addict. He tried everything. Yes, I remember, especially cocaine, heroin. Yeah. He kept diaries of experiences with these drugs, of course. Back then, nobody knew those were addictive drugs. Fair enough. Smell, on the other hand, is a special thing. We now know that a smell gets right through to the brain within 0.3 seconds. Hence, if you like a person or not, it's usually through smell. Interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you, Helen. I did not know that. I'm thinking I'm going to have to put some thought on that. I like that theory. I'm going to have to rattle it around in my brain a bit. That kind of makes some sense. It's usually through smell. Interesting. Well, that was it. We made good progress. Let's see. We've got 2 more stories that'll take us through to the end of part 3. So we'll probably do those and start part 4 next week. And we'll leave on a cliffhanger because chapter 19 is the one we're reading next, and it's the one titled Murder. So we'll have to wait and see just how all of that fits in. On that note, though, I thank you very much for joining me again for another day of reading. It does help me quite a bit. It's reminding me of my vocab. It's helping me say words that I haven't had to think of or hear for a long time. And I'm learning stuff from the book. This is really quite interesting, looking at the brain from this perspective. So thank you very much for being here and hanging out with me. And this is Thursday. So next time I will see you will be on Shenny's channel this Saturday evening. As always, we will be doing game nights starting at 6 p.m. Pacific time. So you guys can do your own maths depending on where you live and that sort of thing. But it'll be 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Shennygram Yell Rock's channel, where we do each Saturday, we do game night. So feel free to join us. And until then, I'll see you soon. Bye.